Okay, we've seen how to populate an array, a one-dimensional array, like this month's data. We've seen how to populate a one-dimensional array with data from a worksheet, like we populated an array with this month's data. Now let's see how we can populate a two-dimensional array from data from the worksheet. And in this case, we're going to take this data here, which is what we worked with already uh, over here. We populated a two-dimensional array in code here. Now let's populate that same array, only now we're not going to do it like this. We're going to populate it from the worksheet. And here it is in the worksheet. I have 4 rows, 3 columns. So let me populate this array. To do that, let's write some code. All we're going to do is use a couple loops. And I'll do sub populate 2D array from Excel. And now I'm going to just declare my array like I did before. Dim exchange rate 3, 2. And now I'm going to declare some other variables. I'm going to need a variable to be the row number. That's going to be the row number from the worksheet. So I'll do xrow as integer and then xcall as integer. What you should notice so far in this class is that when you're manipulating the worksheet, you need variables for the row number and you need variables for the column number. So not variables, just one variable for the row number, one variable for the row number. And in this video, I'm also going to need some other variables. I'll call them, I'll go to the next line and I'll do row index as integer and call index as integer. And I actually should make all these long because I've been doing that. That's the proper way to do it. When you're dealing with rows and columns on a worksheet, they can be over 32,000. And then I want to do just simple things like I as long, j as long. And now I'll set these variables. Row index is equal to 0, call index is equal to 0. And let's go to the worksheet real quick. So I'm just setting up the variable with some code, or with some setting up the code with some variables. Sorry. Where does my data start? It starts in column 3 and row number 2. So I'll set xrow equal to 2 and xcall equal to 1. Now I just need to loop across this range. So here's my range. I'm highlighting it. I just want to put all this data in an array. So I need to loop. First I want to loop down the rows. So I want to go from here to, I want to go from this row to this row, to this row, and then to the third row, and then to the fourth row. I need a loop to go down the rows. And then within each row, I need a loop to go across the columns, to go here, here, here. And then when I'm in this row, I need to go here, here, here. So I need 2 loops. One to go down the rows, and when I'm in the row, one to go across. So we can do that with some do until loops. All I need to do is do something like this. Do until cells x row, comma, x call dot value is equal to blank. Then loop, and I want to increment my row. X row is equal to x row plus 1. Oh, I don't have it. So there we go. Let me just see what this error is. Syntax error. Oh, sorry. Brain freeze. I've had a brain freeze. I don't need the then after the do until. I apologize for that. So this loop will loop down the rows. It'll start in row 2, x row 2, and column 1, and it'll loop down here until it gets to a blank cell. Notice the column is not changing here. In this loop, this is the outer loop. So I'll write that. Outer loop down rows. This is the outer loop. Now we need an inner loop to do a loop inside of here. So I'm just gonna copy this loop because the inner loop is going to look very similar, and I'll paste it here. I'll indent it, and this inner loop is going to loop across columns. So this time I'm going to loop across columns. So I just basically copy the outer loop, and now I have an inner loop within the outer loop. Inner loop across columns. So there's my looping structure. It has two loops to it. The outer loop loops down the rows. It just does this. But it doesn't only do that. At each time you move to a new row, there's another loop. So as soon as I move to this row, I have a, well, no. During the first row, I'm going to have a loop across here. And then when I move to the next row, I'm going to loop across here. And then I'm going to move to the next row, and I'm going to loop across here. So you're gonna be able to go to a row and loop across the row, and then you go to the next row, loop across the row. Okay. So how do we then set our exchange rates up? Well, to do that is very simple. Our exchange rate array, remember, we declared up here as 3, 2. And we just want to populate with the proper data. So to do that, exchange rates. Well, what are we going to put in here? We need two indexes. A row index, so I'm going to, not a row index, a first dimension index. And in this case, I said it's intuitive to think of it like a two-dimensional array, like a table of rows and columns. And in the first dimension, I'm going to put a variable in there called row index. In the second dimension, I'm going to put that variable that I declared up here, call index. And then I'm going to assign it some value. And the value I'm going to assign it is cells x row x call. So notice what I did. When we declared our variables, these two variables are dealing with the row and the column on the worksheet. And these two variables are dealing with the indexes of the array. And as we loop across the row and column of the worksheet, and we loop down the rows and across the columns, all we need to do is, take whatever's on the worksheet by doing this, cells x row, comma x call, and fill up the array by assigning it to the array at the proper index, where row index is 0. Remember up here, row index is 0 and column index starts at 0. And after we assign something to the array, we need to increase the column index so that the array is able to put the data in the right place. So we need to do this. Call index is equal to call index plus 1. And then the same thing down here. When you increase the row on the worksheet, you want to increase your row index for your array. Row index is equal to row index plus 1. So what you're doing is sort of taking data, you're looping across a worksheet, and as you do that, you're filling up an array. So you need to be increasing the rows and the columns on your worksheet, and at the same time you need to be increasing the row in the first dimension index and the second dimension index of your array. And we're doing that here. We're increasing both. This is on the worksheet. Xcol is on the worksheet, and xrow is on the worksheet. So we're increasing our row and column positioning on the worksheet. And then here, col index is in the array, and row index is in the array. We're increasing our position, or moving to another position in the array. One thing we need to do, though, is each time we get through, so let's say we get here, our first time through the loop, we're going to start in this cell and we're going to loop across the column. But then we need to go back to the first column, right? We're going to go down a row and then we need to go back to the first column. So we need to reset a variable. We need to reset the variable over here of xcol equal to 0. Well, actually, no. Xcol is equal to 3, and the column index is equal to 0. So what this is doing is reset after done with row, after finishing row. You're resetting this because you're going from here to here, and you need to go back like that. You need to somehow go back on the worksheet, and that's what this does. You also need to position yourself in the array in the right place. So you need to reset column for a reset second dimension in array. Second dimension index in the array. And then this, well, we know what these are doing. Well, actually, I'll put it in there. That line increases the array index in the second dimension. This increases column on worksheet. This increases the column on the worksheet. And then this increases array index in the first dimension. So there's a lot going on here, but it's very straightforward once you get your head around it. Maybe the comments are confusing. You could delete them from the file that you're looking at and that you download. But all you're doing is taking data and putting it in a structure. And you want to make sure the structure is correct. And you want to make sure you do this. You first deal with the rows, and then you go across the columns. So there's a loop to go across the rows, and then within each row loop, you go across the columns. And when you get to the end of the column, you need to go back. And the same thing with the array. You need to populate the array. Imagine this is the array in memory. Once you populate this, you need to go to the next row and go back to the first element, the 0th element. So that's what these lines over here do. After you populate the first row in your array on your computer, you want to go back to the first element in the array, and that's what that'll do. Okay, so let's see if this works. Let me put an n sub here, and I'm just going to run this. If I run it, I'll clear this watch window. Exchange rates, let's see what it has in it. January Oops, why does it have January in it? Row 2, column 1. Oh, whoa. Xcol should be 3. Sorry. That's why. I had the wrong Xcol in there. So now let me run it again. So now I get Canada CAD 105, which is exactly what I have. Canada CAD 105. And then the second row has Eurozone Euro 129. There you go. The third row, Japan JPY. Fourth row, Mexico MXN 107. So now in memory, I have this exchange rates variable here that is populated with exactly what I have on the worksheet. A two-dimensional array is now on your computer's memory, populated with data that was in your computer in Excel's worksheet, in the worksheet here. And here it is. It's now in your memory, in your computer's memory. Now let's print this out. So now that we have this in memory, I want to show you how to access this. And to do that is pretty straightforward. Again, you're going to need 2 loops, and we are going to use 4 next loops, and we want to know where do we want to print this out. So let's print it out starting in row 8, column 3. So to do that, I'm just going to reset, x row equal to 8 and x call equal to 3, and I'll just put some comment in here, print the array. And again, you're going to need 2 loops. This time we're using 4 next loops, and we've done this before many times. So we'll just do for I is equal to 0 to U bound exchange rates, comma 1. One loop to loop over the first dimension. And now you want another loop inside that loop to loop over the second dimension. So how do you do that? How do you loop over the second dimension? Well, you just change this comma 1 to comma 2. So now you're going to be doing exactly sort of what we did in this worksheet. The first dimension is the rows here. Second dimension is the columns. Think of it like that. And all this loop does, the first loop loops over the rows for I0 equals 0 to U bound exchange rates, comma 1. That loops sort of down the rows. And then within each row, because I nested the loop, within each row, I'm going to loop this way from 0 to the upper bound in the second dimension. And now all I want to do is do this. Cells x row, comma x call dot value is equal to exchange rates I comma j. And oops, this should be a j here. I think I need to declare a j variable up here. Oh no, I don't. That's why I did it. So you need two variables to keep track of in this double loop. The first variable is I. That's going to be the index in the first dimension. The second variable is j. It's going to be the index in the second dimension. And you're going to take whatever element in the array at dimension, in the first dimension, wherever you're at in the first dimension, and wherever you're at in the second dimension, and you're going to put that on the worksheet in x row x call. So let's just, well, if we run this, you can see when I ran it, I didn't get exactly what I wanted here. For I equal to 0. And let me just debug this real quick. if I run this now, my exchange rates, 00 has Canada, and that's correct. So let's see what it does. Let me step through this. Oh yeah, I know why it's doing this. Because I'm not, I didn't increment the X row and the X call. So let me do that here. Notice it's doing the right thing. As I'm stepping through, it's doing Canada, CAD, 105, and then Eurozone, Euro, 129. But why isn't it putting it in the same structure, like rows and columns? Well, it's because I didn't increment my row and column variable for the worksheet. So I have to do that here. In here, I want to do X call is equal to X call plus 1, and down here in this part of the outer for next loop, you got to do X row is equal to X row plus 1. And now if I run it, oops, not oops, this one I knew I was going to see that. Look what happened. I get exactly what I get the right data, but it's not right below each other like it is here. This goes back to what we mentioned previously in the video. When you get to the end of a row, you need to reset your column variable back to whatever column you're in, or else you're going to get something that looks like this. And remember, we did it for both the worksheet and the array. If you didn't do this properly, you would get a bunch of errors in your array. But I didn't do it properly on the worksheet. In the worksheet, it's okay because it'll just go to the next column. But your array, because I sized it, I need to reset this X call equal to 3. So now if I run it, watch what happens. There we go. Everything's perfect. So this was all a mistake because I didn't reset the column. Now I get the data on the worksheet goes into an array, and then it's printed back to the worksheet. If you want to be good with arrays, try to understand this video, because it uses a lot of things. The for next loops to loop over the first dimension, and then the for next loop to loop over the second dimension by doing the comma 1 versus comma 2. And then this here, which has two variables for both indexes, for the one index for the first dimension, one index for the second, you're accessing this array in memory and a position in it at the first dimension, second dimension, bringing it back to the worksheet. But there's the subtleties of, well, what if you didn't reset your variable back to the first column? Well, you would get something that ran off the screen like what we just saw. And if you did it for the array, let me just show you. If you don't reset the second dimension here and you try to run this and you hit enter, you get an error. It says subscript out of range. And that's because this exchange rates, the column index, since I didn't reset it down here to 0, as it loops through, it's going to get bigger than the size you set up here for the second dimension. So it'll get to 3. If you try to put like 3 comma 3 here, let me just show you something quick. If I do something like this, exchange rates 3 comma 3 is equal to T whatever, I'll get an error here. It says, oops, well, I get an error. Oh, I didn't spell it right. It said it wasn't defined. That's because I didn't spell it right. That wasn't the error I'm looking for. This is the error I'm looking for. It says subscript out of range. What that means is that this 3 is out of range because it's bigger than the array. I'm trying to assign something to a place in the array that doesn't even exist. It's out of range. This is out of range right here, this comma 3. It only goes up to an index of 2 in the second dimension. So that'll work. But if you try to put anything else in here, like 6, anything bigger than 2, it's going to give you this subscript out of range error. So that's why it's important when you're dealing with this stuff to know that you have to reset your column variable, not only for the worksheet, but here in this line here, column index, you have to reset that dimension back to 0, or else you're going to get a, watch, if I comment this out, I'm going to get the exact same error, subscript out of range, because I didn't reset it here during that loop. When I'm populating it from the worksheet, during this loop, I'm not resetting it. It all goes back to intuitively, when you're looping across this column, you don't want to keep looping over here. If you do, on your computer's memory, you get a subscript out of range error. So to avoid that, you have to loop just until here and then go back to here by resetting the variable. So that's all this video is. I think it's very useful. This is probably the hardest video from a conceptual standpoint. There's a lot going on, a lot of subtleties, a lot of variables. But if you can understand it, if you can play through it and use the, put a breakpoint here and run it and then look at what's in memory and then step through it line by line, you'll see it's not hard at all. All you're doing again is going from, you're just populating an array and then printing that array from your computer's memory back to the worksheet. That's all for this video. We'll move on to something more interesting coming up.